But the first question is, last year, the government poured more than 1 billion into 19 out of the top 20 countries run by the world's most corrupt regimes, such as Syria, Sudan, Somalia, and North Korea. Tory MP Philip Davis has said, "This is a colossal waste of money. Do the panel agree, and what should we do about it?"
Thank you, Tom. And I suspect that this might be the only question we have tonight where there is a degree of consensus, where I think that there are at least 4 politicians, not Suzanne, who are likely to agree on the fundamentals in relation to aid and overseas aid. Suzanne quoted this figure of £1 billion that's been spent. For instance, and Syria was mentioned, well, the UK government has spent something like £700 million on supporting refugees in and around Syria, and that is countries like Jordan and the Lebanon. And of course, the alternative to doing that, doing nothing, for instance, the alternative and the impact of doing nothing could very well be that a very much greater number of Syrian refugees will seek to come to the United Kingdom, something which I think most of us believe there needs to be control over. So doing nothing actually opens the UK up to a greater threat of illegal immigrants coming to this country, and that's why I think it is worth making that investment in overseas countries. And clearly, as I think Matthew said, there is a very clear correlation between corrupt countries and countries that are the poorest, and therefore it is not that surprising that the UK government is directly involved in providing aid to those countries. And just to give you a few, finally, just a few figures, because I think it's important that when UKIP talks about slashing the aid budget, because that's what they're talking about, I think we need to know, out of the things that I'm about to list, which of the things they think are not necessary. So in the last year, the UK government provided 43 million people with access to clean water, prevented 19 million children under 15 and pregnant women from going hungry, reached over 11 million people with emergency food assistance, and supported 10 million children into primary and lower secondary schools. So that is what our investment overseas is going into. If UKIP wants to slash the aid budget, which of those things are not necessary? Can I just say, I think the difficulty with what Suzanne has just said is that the things that she has just mentioned in terms of areas which she thinks should be cut do not amount to the 80% cut that UKIP is advocating. So many of the things that I've just listed, which she said were necessary, are in fact, if UKIP were to be in charge, those are exactly the sort of things that would be cut, because you can't cut 80% from the budget without cutting some of those measures.
Well, we'd also cut a huge amount from the budget by abolishing the Department for International Development in the first place, which racks up astonishing administration costs. They opened an office in India, they spent nearly £500,000 on furniture. I think that's unacceptable.
Who would do the work then? If you get rid of the department, who's going to do the work?
It would go back into the auspices of the Foreign Department, where it was before and worked perfectly well and functioned perfectly happily.
Peter Morgan. Poverty, you say it's in corrupt countries. Question 1, what is the aid being, how is aid being used to address the bad governance in countries? Question 2, I don't think it's true that corrupt equals poor. Ghana's quite a poor country, but it's not a corrupt country. Population growth is a major problem with poverty. What are we doing to address population growth? For example, the population of Nigeria went up 6 times in 50 years. If populations are going to grow at that rate, how are we going to address poverty? What are we doing to address population growth? Why is the aid budget increasing when other budgets are cut or held? What's the justification for actually increasing the aid? And none of the panelists have explained how they will get aid spent effectively. Zimbabwe, corrupt country, brutal dictator in charge, ruthless control. How can we help the people in Zimbabwe without helping Mugabe stay in power? Thank you.
Tom, can I just add, As a number of the panelists have said, the best way of controlling population growth is actually investing in education, and investing in education of young women so that they have alternatives. And that is where a substantial proportion of the budget is going. And indeed, maybe also on gender equality initiatives that Suzanne didn't feel was a good investment of our government's budget. Why was the budget protected? The budget was protected because the coalition government agreed that we would protect the budget, that we would secure 0.7% for international development, just as we agreed that we would protect the NHS budget and the budget for schools. That was a political decision, but I think it was the right thing to do. As Matthew said, the commitment that the UK government made to United Nations to deliver 0.7% GNI more than 30 years ago is one that we have finally delivered. And it's my only regret that the UK is one of the, in fact, the only G7 country that has delivered on that pledge.
Is Trevor Davis in the audience? Yes. Thank you very much, Trevor. You asked 3 very good questions, and I'll start with the first, if I may. This is your statement. The EU is a racket that looks after its own. A true statement by Nigel Farage, especially in the context of the question, does charity begin at home? There is talk about the UK taxpayers paying towards EU pensions. Would one of the panelists like to make a comment, please?
Well, shall I start? And then Matthew, when I'm sure he's written many speeches for the CBI on the positive aspects of the EU. I'm sure he'll want to come in behind me. I disagree with you. The EU is not a racket. What the EU has provided, it has flaws, I accept that, and those need to be addressed. I think, for instance, the rigmarole of the Parliament meeting in 2 places is an outrage and needs to be stopped immediately. I think some of the issues around transparency, if you think members of Parliament have issues around transparency to do with their expenses, I think in the European Union, European Parliament, I think there are significant, even greater issues that need to be addressed. But fundamentally, what the EU is about ensuring that a UK company can produce something here and know that that product can be exported to any other EU country without tariffs applying. And what that provides for us as consumers, I think, is a better deal in terms of the products that we can buy, the products that we can purchase. It provides certainty to manufacturers here that when they produce a product that they will be able to get it into a different market. And of course, manufacturers here are the people who provide many jobs. So yes, as I said, I think there are aspects of the EU that we do need to address. I think that the EU needs to tighten its belt in the way that the UK government has had to tighten its belt. I was astounded that the EU was putting in a request for a large budget increase at the same time as the UK government was by necessity having to reduce our budget here. So, but I think the business aspect of it is something that is very positive.
Thank you very much.
I have contributed, so I won't contribute again, but I would like to ask Matthew whether when he wrote speeches for the CBI about the EU, whether he ever called the EU a racket.
Well, it wasn't me making the speeches, so I'm sure I would never have put that word in the Director General's.
No, I'm sure.
But it might have been there in the subtext. And actually, I did write speeches about the European Union, and I criticised Michel Barnier, who was the Commissioner for Financial Services. And I said that some of his worst ideas were created by Laboratoire Barnier, and they were particularly damaging to one of this country's really great industries, which is financial services. So I wasn't against criticising them, or indeed putting the words in someone else's mouth, but I was normally skulking in the background somewhere. So had it been me, racket is a word I might well have used.
Is Leanne Bruni in the audience? Thank you, Leanne. Leanne's question is, 1 in 4 children in the UK live in poverty. Bearing this in mind, shouldn't our priority be eliminating poverty in the UK as opposed to abroad?
Clearly, the governments, the coalition governments, have put in place a number of measures to deal with poverty in the UK amongst children, and that is why, for instance, we have invested very heavily in free school meals. So, for instance, reception year 1, year 2 pupils will get free school meals. That helps to address poverty in terms of, for parents, it's worth about £400 a year to a parent. We've provided free nursery education for 3 and 4-year-olds. We're now providing free nursery education for 40% of 2-year-olds. So there are measures that the UK government are taking to try and address poverty, particularly poverty amongst children. But I think, as Matthew said, the issue about relative poverty is that you could have a situation where people were living comfortably at home, but 60% of the population had a much larger disposable income, and you would find people in relative poverty. So I think and I don't think you can make a comparison with what is happening in developing countries and say, well, it's relative to them. If they're living off $1 a day, that's fine, because $1 a day in their country is an adequate level of standard of living. In practice, as I quoted almost at the beginning, the UK government is funding 19 million children under 5 and pregnant women from going hungry. So it's not about relative poverty in developing countries, it's actually about funding them so that they don't starve.
Leanne, we need to pass you the mic because we're recording this and we can't hear it unless you have a microphone.
So I just wanted to say there are people starving in this country, hence the rise of food banks. So, and also I want to say, when you're talking about relative poverty, there's a strong rich-poor divide. So what are you doing about that? Because there's people living in, it is relative, but it's still not fair. That, for example, it was in the news that, you know, they called it Fat Cat Friday or something, where the richest people had earned most of what we had earned in just a few weeks. You know, they'd earned, you know, the average salary of, you know, 30,000 or something in just a few days. And that's what some people in Britain earn for the whole year. So I think we've got to look at this disparity. You know, there's a real disparity, and we shouldn't just dismiss it by saying, oh, it's relative. Because, you know, let's be honest, you all on the panel are not living in that relative poverty.
Well, can I just point out that under the present government, inequality has actually reduced. I agree with you, however, that it is something that any government needs to continue to address, because it's very clear that the countries where the level of inequality is the smallest tend to be the countries that are actually the healthiest, if I can put it that way, typically the Scandinavian countries.
To substantiate your figures there, Robert, 1 million children go to bed every night hungry. 900 billion people go to bed without clean water in the following morning. And 2.4 billion people don't have a toilet. So this is what we're comparing ourselves with. Those poor people that don't have water and don't have sanitation. Thank you, Robert.
Oh, okay. It's just one thing that's bothering me about all this poverty and everything, is that a lot of rich people, and especially rich foreign investors, are just buying up all our properties in England and just raking off money from there. And that means that people who live here actually can't afford to buy their own homes and can't afford to live. And that is increasing the poverty of this country. And what good is that doing to ordinary people? Is anything at all being done to stop this happening? Because it's really upsetting. I mean, it started off with people buying places in Cornwall, rich people buying places, and then local people can't afford to buy. I personally think it ought to be illegal for foreigners to buy places here until they've lived here for at least 10 years. And I think that people shouldn't be able to just buy second homes and just rent them out. I don't believe in property for investment, because it's making people homeless. It's just not fair.
Well, first of all, what can we do about it? And here I think there's a different coalition around the issue of the £2 million sort of mansion tax, as it's been dubbed, as in people who with properties that are worth £2 million or more having to make a more substantial contribution. And I think this is where there is a difference of opinion between the two coalition partners in terms of how do we finish addressing the budget deficit. And I think the Conservative Party wants to do that by, I think, making further cuts. We think that, yes, unfortunately, there is a need to reduce budgets, and that's why Sasha is right. A couple of days ago, there was an agreement, a cross-party agreement, certainly the main parties, that there is a need to reduce budgets by £30 billion to ensure that we get rid of the deficit. But one of the ways that we would do that as a party, and I think the Labour Party have indicated as well, is by generating some more revenue by ensuring that people who are property owners of properties that are worth £2 million or more, in other words, very wealthy people, are making a greater contribution financially than is currently the case. The other side, I think, of your question is, of course, we are suffering from a major housing shortage in London. So yes, there is on the one hand foreigners buying up some of the most expensive properties, but realistically the demand is for properties that are not the £10 million properties, it's for affordable homes. And that's why certainly we have plans which would see something like 270,000 new affordable homes built in London. How would that be done? That would be done, for instance, by using the land that the mayor has more effectively, whether it's Transport for London, the GLA, the land that they have that could be brought into use, and various other measures to boost the availability of housing, because that is the fundamental problem, the problem that I see in my surgery every week. It's young people, it's families who cannot afford to buy any properties, and that is partly because there is a shortage of supply.
Flat as well, and I'm going to buy that flat, and I'm going to buy that flat, and so other people can't get them because the price goes up so much. How are you going to stop that? How? Well,
the question is from Raj Sood, and the question is, when will the government and the Labour Party listen to its 70 million citizens? Can the traditional parties not understand that we are simply fed up with foreign aid policy and the cuts that affect us here? When will you hear us? After the next coalition of UKIP and the Greens?
Interest repayments that we are having to make as a result of our debt, which of course is generated because we have a deficit, the amount that we spend on interest is greater than the total that is spent on law and order, Ministry of Justice and Transport put together, for instance. So if we don't deal with those economic problems, then actually all we end up doing is paying interest on the debt that we're incurring. So good luck to UKIP if they think by putting forward two policies, one's come out of the EU and two to stop immigration, if they think that is the solution to the deficit, well, they can say that if they want, but let's make sure that the facts that they are deploying are correct. The great thing about technology is that you can instantly check some of the things that were said. So this figure of 55 million that Suzanne talks about, well, actually, if we want to be accurate, it's 33 million, so that's inflated by 80%. The figure that she referred to in terms of how much on each energy bill do the environmental measures cost us, which is incidentally a figure that was provided by an energy company. She said £93. I think the IPPR, which I accept is a left-wing think tank and therefore may not be entirely independent, suggests actually the cost is £15. So it's important that when we have these arguments that actually we do it on the basis of fact rather than fantasy, because otherwise there's no point in having the discussion.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. We could spend another 2 hours quite easily, but sadly time won't permit it. I'd like to ask the audience their views. There's been a great deal of time spent about overseas aid. I'd like you to raise your hand if you feel that we should continue with the same level of overseas aid. Please raise your hand if you think we should. Oh, that's good. It's about 60–70%. Thank you very much indeed for attending. Thank you, panelists, for your excellent answers. And thank you very much for your questions. Good night.